Our first stop is in Africa, and we'll begin in the extreme south of the continent in what is now the Republic of South Africa. South Africa's borders aren't too crazy, just the ocean and a couple major rivers, but it's got a notch in where Swaziland, or Eswatini, lives, and a hole where Lesotho is. Kind of looks like a leaf that's been chewed up by a caterpillar. The southern half of Africa is a giant plateau, apparently thrusted up by a great magma plume in ancient times. The entire coast of South Africa is lined by the Great Escarpment, a chain of cliffs and slopes separating the plateau from the lowlands. The eastern portion is known as the Drakensberg, the Dragon's Mountains in Dutch. A narrow band along the southwestern coast, below the Great Escarpment, has a fairly pleasant Mediterranean climate, home to the fynbos, a unique African bushland. This grades into subtropical savanna eastwards. On the plateau, the western half is dominated by the Karoo, a shrubby desert that transitions to the mighty Kalahari Desert, which in South Africa resembles more a dry savanna. Further east, the desert gives way to the Veld, a high grassland. Further north, the high Veld becomes the Bushveld, dotted with trees and shrubs, while the eastern slopes off the plateau are home to the low Veld. South Africa is mostly temperate, and the interior especially experiences frosts in winter. Fossil evidence puts the earliest humans in Africa, perhaps as early as 2.5 million years ago. But anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, appear about 300,000 years ago in Africa, maybe in East Africa. From here we outcompeted and interbred with other species of archaic human, and spread across the world. Genetic studies indicate that about 150,000 years ago, humans became separated into two distinct population clusters, one containing the ancestors of the original inhabitants of South Africa, and the other, everyone else. In earlier days, anthropologists referred to the first group as Khoisan, combining the Kwekwe and San people. But the reality is more complicated, and those same anthropologists would have considered the Khoisan one of the ancient stocks of men. I like that term, but if I can go off on an aside, the anthropological concepts of stocks and races is mired in decades of sociological and political connotations and all sorts of messy things. The matter is further complicated by the fact that all living fertile humans can, in fact, successfully interbreed with one another. However, while the concept of race has been discredited in many scientific circles, there do exist distinct genetic lineages of humans, and geographic populations do exhibit certain physical and physiological traits. The Khoisan, for instance, have a rust-colored complexion and epicanthic folds, something they share with otherwise unrelated populations in East Asia that gives those people their distinctive eyes. The stock from which the Khoisan descend was probably much more widespread, including perhaps all humans south of the Congo rainforest. Since splitting from other humans so long ago, they continued their hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Probably around the beginning of the Common Era, a group of these Khoisan acquired cattle, possibly as the Bantu people continued to spread further south from West Africa. These new pastoralist people became the Kwekwe, distinct from the San Bushmen. Apparently, the Kwekwe have some Eurasian component to their ancestry, perhaps indicating they got their cattle from migrating Cushitic peoples from the Horn of Africa. We'll get to them eventually. The Kwekwe cattle herders probably inhabited the regions of the Veld and fynbos and the land beside the Orange River, while the San remained in the harsh Karoo and Kalahari, where grazeland would have been scarce. Then, the Bantu came in one of the most fateful migrations of humanity. The Bantu probably arose as a distinct group about 2000 BC, around Cameroon or Nigeria, and began an epic expansion to dominate the south of Africa over the next several thousand years. These were no hunter-gatherers. They farmed crops like millet and sorghum. They raised cattle, and made tools and weapons of iron. Against such a mighty Iron Age culture, the pre-existing peoples in the lands south of the Congo could do little with their thinner numbers. Like what we will see time and again, the more populous and technologically advanced culture supplants a previous one. This process would have been long and complex, involving assimilation, intermarriage, expulsion, and naked, brutal conquest. Unlike the European colonization in the modern era, which we'll get to, the Bantu expansion was not recorded, so we only have archaeological and genetic evidence and studies of peoples in Africa today. The result was Bantu speakers, so-called Black Africans, who possessed darker complexions than the Khoisan, replaced their forebears in much of southern Africa around the 1st century AD. In fact, the Khoisan really only survived in the Karoo and Fenbus. The former, of course, because the desert offers little opportunity for farming or ranching, and the latter possibly because sorghum and millet fare poorly in the dry summer climate of the Cape. The Bantu of South Africa evolved into a couple of distinct groups: the Tsonga of the Lowveld, the Sotho of the Veldt, and the Nguni of the eastern coast and Drakensberg. Exactly when these distinctions emerged is a good question. The divergence probably began in the first millennium AD. But it should be remembered that, as with all peoples, pre-modern ethnic identity can be hard to pin down, often based on smaller-scale kinship lines, clans, and local tribes, rather than larger concepts of ethnicity or nation. Divergence based on geographic and political barriers manifests in differing languages and culture, but peoples often exist as a continuum where the lines between blur due to trade, intermarriage, conquest, and migration. Anyway, by the 10th century, a group of more northerly Bantu people, the Shona, had established a kingdom along the Limpopo River, called by archaeologist Mapungubwe. Raids and conquests southwards created an overclass of Shona with local Sotho, eventually giving rise to a distinct Venda people of the Bushveld. Around the 1500s, a group of Sotho began migrating into the Kalahari, emerging as a distinct Tswana people, for whom Botswana is named, though more Tswana live in South Africa than their own nation-state. At the same time, some Nguni traveled inland across the Drakensberg into the High Veld north of the Vaal River. There, they warred with the Sotho, but survived, and became the Ndebele. Now, while the Khoisan go about their 100,000-year-old business and the Bantu continue to diversify, a third component to South Africa arrives: Europeans. There is speculation that Europeans had rounded the Cape of Good Hope in antiquity, but definitively, Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias was the first to have led an expedition that discovered South Africa for Europe in 1488. Vasco da Gama later followed up and kept going to India. Permanent European settlement only came with the Dutch. In 1652, a small port was established at the Cape for resupply by the Dutch United East India Company. Soon, the company began encouraging the settlement of discharged employees. The mild climate of the Cape favored the growing of good European crops like wheat and barley, and Cape Town grew in earnest. Naturally, this brought the Dutch settlers into conflict with the native Khoikhoi cattlemen, and fighting began over land rights. Dutch settlers, along with Calvinist Germans and French Huguenots, encroached on land more and more, and this, coupled with disease and violence, shrank the Khoikhoi numbers ever further. The Dutchmen in the Cape Colony began emerging as a distinct people of Cape Dutch. Slaves were also imported to work the newly cultivated land, not only from Mozambique and Africa, but also from the Dutch colonies in Indonesia and India. And as naturally happens when different groups intermingle, they do so in blood as well. Predominantly the result of Dutchmen and Khoisan women, but also Indians, other Europeans, and Bantu, a mixed-race Cape-colored group was born. So, the four-part South African demography of white, colored, Indian, and black came to be. The Dutch Cape Colony was ruled by the company, with the intent of developing agricultural exports. Many settlers didn't like this control, and a number left behind the laws and safety of the colony to strike out on their own in the wide lands of the Karoo as trekboers, the traveling farmers. They formed a rugged culture of frontiersmen, jealous of their space and suspicious of outsiders. The company didn't appreciate this, and restless natives prompted them to stretch further along the coast, agreeing to the Great Fish River as the border between the Cape Colony and the Xhosa in 1780. The French Revolution, meanwhile, brought further disturbances to South Africa. The French Republic had taken over the Netherlands in 1795, and disgruntled Trekboers took the opportunity to declare the districts of Swellendam and Graaff-Reinet as independent republics. However, the British, at war with France, saw a hostile Cape Colony as a threat against their possessions in India, and captured the Cape in 1796. Britain handed the colony back to the Netherlands, now the Batavian Republic, in 1803. By then, Napoleon Bonaparte had taken over France and soon became emperor, and hostilities continued. Britain retook the Cape, this time for good. In 1814, the Dutch finally accepted the loss. While the Cape was being colonized, the Nguni tribes accreted into various kingdoms, the Xhosa, who have the most visible admixture with Khoisan, the Swazi, and most famous, the Zulu. In 1816, Shaka Katsendzangankona became king of the Zulu. He was a powerful warrior and led his armies in the Mfecane. This was a warpath, a conquest of land and cattle, killing the men and claiming the women and children for the Zulu. This greatly disrupted the region and prompted many to flee in the wake of Shaka Zulu. Some fled and joined the Xhosa. Others went north to the Swazi. The general Soshangane led his clan to the lower Limpopo River and conquered the Tsonga, founding the Gaza kingdom. A disgraced general of Shaka, Mzilikazi, led his clan north to the Indebele lands and formed a new Zulu Indebele kingdom called Matebele. Still further, Zwangendaba led his people all the way to Lake Malawi, creating the Ngoni. The southern Sutu clans, the Basutu, rallied around Moshweshwe I, who became first king of Lesotho. The northern Sutu clans had by now emerged as the distinct Pedi kingdom. Now, I'll be honest and admit I'm a bit of a British apologist. Colonialism and imperialism have left a very complex legacy across the world, but I won't lie and say it was all bad. The new British Cape Colony government began recognizing some rights of the native Africans and even abolished slavery in 1834. And though largely unsuccessful, the British did try to quell violence between Cape Dutch and natives. Brits also began settling the eastern colony. However, the British did impose English language and English law, and this combined with their inability to properly reconcile the Cape Dutch and native Khoisan and Xhosa led to the Great Trek. From 1835 onwards, about one-fifth of the Cape Dutch, 12,000 people, as well as Dutch-speaking coloreds called Griqua, moved northeast to the Veldt, desperate to escape the British. Those who stayed behind gradually became known as Afrikaners. Those who participated were called Voortrekkers, pioneers, and mingled with Trekboers to become the Boer people. Naturally, this brought them into conflict with the Bantu already there, especially the Zulu. The Mfecane, however, both due to violence and migration, had made a mess of previous land occupation, and many Boers wandered into seemingly empty ranges that Africans claimed. Neither were particularly interested in coexisting. In 1837, Boers established themselves in Zulu territory, with permission, but soon war broke out. The Boers won, and established the Republic of Port Natal and neighboring countries from Zulu lands south of the Tugela River. Boers north of the Vaal River then defeated Mzilikazi in 1838, who withdrew the Matabele north across the Limpopo. The British, for their part, had been warring with the Xhosa, waging 6 of the total 9 Xhosa wars. After the 5th in 1819, they pushed the Cape to the Keiskamma River, and after the 7th to the Great K River in 1847. They also formally extended their colony north to the Orange River. The British had founded Port Natal in 1824, and conflict with the Natal Republic finally prompted the Empire to annex the small republic in 1843, setting the boundary north by the Drakensberg, west by the Mzumkulu River and the Xhosa, and northeast by the Tugela and Buffalo Rivers. Most Boers fled the new Natal colony to further inland in the veldt, replaced by English settlers. The British colonial government encroached ever further when it claimed to annex the Boer communities between the Vaal and Orange Rivers as the Orange River Sovereignty in 1848. The British, however, in 1852, did recognize the independence of the Boers north of the Vaal, which organized themselves as the South African Republic, or the Transvaal, to avoid confusion. In 1854, the British parliamentary government decided to withdraw from the Orange River Sovereignty, which became the Orange Free State. Both of these new Boer republics claimed land that was still inhabited by Bantu, leading to more conflict. Griqua also established their own countries, a Griqualand West, just north of the Orange River in the Kalahari, sometime in the 1840s, and New Griqualand, or Griqualand East, in Xhosa lands between the Mzimvubu and Mzimkulu rivers in 1862. Previously beyond the greater concerns of the empire, the interior changed when diamonds were discovered in 1866 in Griqualand West. British, Boers, and Griqua alike wanted in, so the Griqua placed themselves under British protection in 1871, annexed as a colony in 1873, while prospectors flocked to make their fortune, including a young Cecil Rhodes. The next year, the British did the same with Griqualand East, and annexed both to the Cape, east in 1879 and west in 1880. But at least the now British Griqua were allowed to vote in the Cape Colony. Fearing the Orange Boers, King Moshoeshoe of Lesotho allowed his country to become a British protectorate in 1868. The Orange Free State had conquered much of his land, confining Lesotho to the land between the Caledon and Orange Rivers and the Drakensberg, the border defined in 1869. Lesotho was annexed to the Cape in 1871, but re-established as the separate colony of Basutoland in 1884. British imperialists, inspired by the recent Confederation of the North American Colonies into Canada in 1867, felt a similar arrangement between the South African colonies and Boer republics would be beneficial, and also help consolidate British control under pressure from neighboring European powers. This, coupled with financial and military difficulties in the Transvaal, led to its annexation in 1877, but British misrule led to the First Boer War in 1880. Defeat in 1881 forced the British to recognize the Transvaal as a self-governing protectorate, and its borders were defined, the northern limit at the Limpopo to its confluence with the Luvuvu, and the eastern with the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, essentially along the edge of the Lowveld. Transvaal had already agreed to recognize Portuguese control of Delagoa Bay in 1869, and Portugal and Britain set their boundary in 1875, a line drawn from the Maputo River before it turns north. In 1881, the Swazi Kingdom became the protectorate of Swaziland, which was nevertheless forced to cede western territories to Transvaal. In 1884, Transvaal became fully independent and assumed protection of Swaziland. After 9 wars, the Xhosa were finally conquered in 1879, added to the Cape Colony, while the Zulu were defeated, despite the famous British defeat at Isandlwana. A few more Boer republics emerged in the 1880s. The state of Goshen and Republic of Stellaland were established in 1882 by Boers in the Kalahari, uniting in 1883 as the United States of Stellaland. Cecil Rhodes, owner of several diamond mines in the area, future founder of De Beers, and an ardent British patriot and imperialist, viewed this development as a threat to British interests further north in the Zambezi. By now, the scramble for Africa had begun in earnest. We'll talk more about this, but the European great powers were starting to look to Africa in the later 19th century as a source of raw materials, imperial prestige, and geopolitical interests. Adventurers, explorers, and developers set out for the dark heart of Africa. Men like Cecil Rhodes considered Central Africa to have great opportunity for wealth. As fast as they could, colonial authorities penetrated and exerted control over as much land as they could, with a grand plan to lay a railroad and telegraph line from Cape to Cairo. In 1878, the British set up Walvis Bay in the Namib Desert, along with the uninhabited Penguin Islands, as part of the Cape. 1885, the British concluded treaties with Tswana leaders, establishing the Bechuana Land Protectorate. The Tswana lands south of the Molopo River, however, became the colony of British Bechuanaland. Along the route to the interior of Africa, Stellaland was annexed to Bechuanaland the same year. However, in 1884, a disgraced son of King Echiwayo of the Zulu, Dinu Zulu, appealed to Boers to help him restore his throne. They did, and as a reward, Dinu Zulu gave them land around the Mfolozi River, becoming the new republic. The remaining Zulu kingdom was made a British colony in 1887, along with the Boer coast. The British didn't want the Boers to have access to the sea, and soon the new republic joined the Transvaal. Germany, though never a traditional colonial power, got in on the scramble game and settled the coast northwest of the Cape. An 1890 treaty set the boundary. Germany got to keep their new colony of German Southwest Africa, south to the Orange River, and west of some lines drawn through the Kalahari Desert. They really wanted Walvis Bay too, but the British wouldn't budge. In 1895, British Bechuanaland was annexed to the Cape, with land south of the Nosob taken from the Protectorate. In 1897, the Zulu colony was annexed to Natal Colony. Meanwhile, a huge deposit of gold had been found in Transvaal, and the gold rush attracted British settlers to the country, which the Boers disliked, especially when the English brought along native workers. The Boers also tried to bypass the British with a railroad to Delagoa Bay. British migrants agitated for political rights in Transvaal, and a failed attempt to overthrow the government only increased tensions. British imperialists wanted the land, the gold, and the power. Cecil Rhodes and others rattled their sabers. But it was the Boers who struck first. Both the Transvaal and Orange Free State mobilized and attacked British settlements. The resulting Second Boer War would soon devolve into nasty guerrilla war by Boer commandos, and the first widespread use of concentration camps. What was supposed to be a short colonial action turned into a 3-year slog, but finally, the British emerged victorious in 1902, the Boers broken. The Boer republics were annexed as the Orange River and Transvaal colonies, and Natal colony acquiring some territory from Transvaal. Tensions were still high with the Boers, but concessions of self-government soon led to union. In 1910, the 4 colonies of the Cape, Natal, Orange River, and Transvaal were united into the Union of South Africa, a dominion of the British Crown like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the so-called white settler colonies. Finally, after all this time, we have an actual country of South Africa, and its borders are basically the same as today. I guess I could end the video here, but there's probably something that comes to your mind when you hear South Africa. The Union was conceived as a means to buttress the white population amongst the natives, and of course anchor British imperial power. It was the marriage of African English and Dutchmen, just as Canada was supposed to be the marriage of American English and Frenchmen. Unlike the other dominions, South Africa was never majority white, 20% in 1910. The reasons are complex, but I'll give 2 main ones. First, South Africa didn't experience the same native demographic collapse that happened in America and Australia through disease, famine, and war. The Bantu were a robust people, with the immunity and technology to contest European encroachment. Second, South Africa was never the most desirable location for European immigrants. Sure, it had its share of migrants, tens of thousands through the 19th and 20th centuries, but this pales in comparison to the hundreds of thousands, millions, who immigrated to the US, Canada, Australia, and even Brazil and Argentina. Demographically, South Africa resembled more Peru or Mexico, with whites, but also a large population of native reds and mixed mestizos. However, Whereas the ruling Spanish aspired to make the natives good Spanish-speaking Catholics, Boers preferred to live in their own communities, trying to ignore the fact that they shared the country with blacks, or even the Cape Coloreds, who spoke, dressed, and acted just like them. And they weren't too keen on other whites either. It was bad enough the English were there. Anyway, following Germany's defeat in World War I, the new League of Nations dispensed German Southwest Africa to South Africa as a mandate, who treated it like a fifth province. In 1921, Walvis Bay was transferred to South African Southwest Africa. The next year, a referendum was held in southern Rhodesia, which will be an interesting future episode, if they wished to join the Union, but they declined. South Africa also kept lobbying for the three British protectorates in southern Africa, Basutoland, Swaziland, and Bechuanaland, to be incorporated, but the British never allowed this. Britain did in 1948, however, give them the small, uninhabited Prince Edward Islands in the southern Indian Ocean, for what it's worth. Relations with the Crown were always a little strained, and many Afrikaners, a term that had steadily come to embrace both Cape Dutch and the Boers beyond the Orange River, distrusted British designs, British-owned banks and mines, and with industrialization, factories. Economic growth caused both Afrikaner farmers and African blacks to migrate to cities, and many whites feared they would be lost amongst the native majority. The Statute of Westminster in 1931 made the Dominions effectively independent. British policy had attempted to further integrate coloreds and natives into South African political and economic life, but was steadily being reversed, culminating in the fateful election of 1948. The ruling pro-British United Party lost its majority to the pro-Afrikaner National Party, and they set about creating the various state apparati of apartheid. Now, the reasons and methods of apartheid, literally meaning apartness or aparthood, are complex. I don't want to go too in-depth, but people were classified according to race into four groups: white, black, colored, and Indian. Interracial relationships were outlawed, non-whites were disenfranchised, public spaces were segregated, blacks were deported to their own towns, and a police state was created to enforce this authoritarian regime. The goal was to maintain white dominance, specifically Afrikaner, over South Africa. South Africa was always the black sheep of the Crown Dominions, where Englishmen were a minority even among whites, and disagreements with Britain prompted it to break with the Empire, becoming the Republic of South Africa. The most ridiculous scheme of apartheid was the creation of 10 Bantustans in the 1960s and 70s, 20 if you count the 10 in Southwest Africa, Namibia after 1968. The 10 in South Africa were Bophuthatswana, KwaNdebele, Leboa, Venda, Gazankulu, Kangwane, KwaZulu, Kwakwa, Transkei, and Ciskei, each a home for one of the various Bantu groups. Similar to Indian reservations, the idea was to deport the Bantu to these places, stripped of their citizenship, where they could govern themselves, but it was never completed. These Bantustans were meant to be autonomous or even independent, but were never recognized by the international community for being such ridiculous, disjointed slithers of land that honestly could never be viable countries. But the times they were a-changin'. The Western world was moving away from segregation and towards integration. Boycotts, sanctions, and poor economic growth, along with the rise of the African National Congress led by Nelson Mandela, forced the regime to institute some reforms. The Cold War and the National Party's fierce anti-communism allowed the West to put up with apartheid, but after 1991, that position became untenable. The UN had declared Namibia independent in 1966, but South Africa stayed, detaching Walvis Bay out of spite. But after a slog of a conflict along with international pressure, South Africa finally recognized Namibian independence in 1990, though they kept Walvis Bay until 1994. It was also this year that the first election was held after most of the apartheid laws were repealed. The ANC won handily, and the Bantustans were put out of their misery. South Africa, I'm sorry to say, has had troubles in the decades since. The ANC has ruled the country for 30 years, compared to the National Party's 46-year rule. And honestly, one party, any party, ruling for so long isn't healthy for a democracy. South Africa continues to struggle with poverty, inequality, corruption, crime, and unemployment. Afrikaners' fears kinda came true. But it's not all bad. South Africa continues to be a vibrant place. It has lions and elephants and a beautiful and unique environment with a rich cultural diversity. It's really a fascinating place with a very interesting history, as you saw. We still have the rest of southern Africa to visit, and next time we'll go to South Africa's little enclave, Lesotho. I'll see you there. Thank you for watching.